Would you still stop to help someone if you believed you would never see them again? The question lingered in the cool night air like the last note of an old hymn as Ethan Walker eased his aging Ford pickup beneath the glowing lights outside the Grand Crescent Hotel in downtown Chicago. Rain had fallen less than an hour earlier, leaving the sidewalks shimmering beneath rows of street lamps that reflected across polished black stone and glass. Luxury cars slipped silently toward the entrance, valets hurried from door to door, and executives dressed in tailored suits disappeared into waiting SUVs without ever noticing the people standing only a few feet away. Ethan wasn't there for any of that. He had just finished delivering a rebuilt transmission to a repair shop across town, and every mile on the odometer reminded him that tomorrow would begin before sunrise all over again. His 8-year-old daughter, Lily, was waiting at home with a microwave dinner and a handwritten note that simply read, "Drive safe, Daddy." Ever since Amelia had passed away 5 years earlier, those 2 words had become the center of his universe. As Ethan stopped at a red light, movement near the hotel's marble staircase caught his attention. A young woman in an elegant navy evening dress stumbled awkwardly, trying to steady herself against a stone column before her knees nearly gave way. Several guests glanced toward her, frowned with quiet discomfort, then continued walking. A pair of hotel employees exchanged uncertain looks, but remained frozen behind the glass doors, unsure whether to intervene. One sharply dressed businessman muttered, "Someone should call her assistant," before climbing into the back of a waiting sedan. Ethan pulled his truck to the curb without thinking twice. He stepped into the cool evening breeze, keeping a respectful distance as he spoke gently. "Ma'am, are you all right?" The woman slowly lifted her head. Her eyes struggled to focus. Not with anger, but with exhaustion that seemed to reach far deeper than a single difficult evening. She tried to answer, but only managed a quiet whisper before losing her balance again. Ethan reached forward just enough to keep her from falling onto the wet pavement, careful, steady, and respectful. A security guard hurried over, his expression tense. "Sir, I'd leave this alone if I were you," he warned. "She's probably important. You don't want trouble." Ethan looked down at the stranger leaning weakly against his arm. "Tonight," he answered softly, "she doesn't need someone important. She needs someone kind." The guard hesitated. Another passerby shook his head. "You'll regret this," he said. Ethan simply offered a faint smile. Regret was something he already understood. He had learned long ago that kindness rarely arrived at a convenient moment. It usually appeared when everyone else decided to walk away. Inside the woman's designer handbag rested a phone vibrating with dozens of unanswered calls, messages from board members, attorneys, and assistants who desperately searched for Victoria Hayes, the youngest CEO in the company's history. Ethan knew none of that. To him, she was only a tired stranger whose world seemed far heavier than the rain-soaked night surrounding them. As he carefully helped her into the passenger seat, the dashboard clock clicked to 10:14 p.m. Neither of them realized that before sunrise, a forgotten family secret buried for nearly 3 decades would quietly begin finding its way home. Ethan drove through the quiet streets with both hands steady on the wheel, while the soft hum of the old truck filled the silence between them. The woman beside him had fallen asleep almost instantly, her breathing slow and uneven, her head resting carefully against the passenger seat. She looked nothing like the confident executives whose faces sometimes appeared on business magazines sitting beside grocery store checkout lines. Whatever had happened before he found her had stripped away every title and every accomplishment, leaving only a tired human being carrying a burden too heavy to hide. Ethan glanced toward the folded card holder that had slipped halfway from her handbag when he helped fasten her seatbelt. He hesitated for a moment before carefully reading the address printed on the identification inside. Victoria Hayes. The name meant nothing to him. The address, however, belonged to one of the oldest estates along the northern shore of Lake Michigan, nearly 40 miles from downtown. He quietly sighed. It would add almost an hour to his drive home, but leaving her anywhere else never crossed his mind. Amelia had always believed that kindness should never depend on convenience. Even after all these years, Ethan still heard her gentle voice whenever life offered him a difficult choice. Sometimes Lily asked what her mother had been like. Ethan always answered the same way. She was the kind of person who noticed the lonely child in a crowded room, the elderly neighbor carrying groceries, or the stranger who looked like they needed someone to believe in them for 5 more minutes. Those small lessons had become the inheritance Amelia left behind. As the city lights slowly faded into quiet suburban neighborhoods, Ethan reached for the radio before deciding against it. The silence felt more respectful somehow. Victoria stirred slightly and whispered something too softly to understand. One word stood out. Mom. There was sadness in the way she said it. Not anger, not fear. Only the quiet ache of someone who wished one conversation could have gone differently. Ethan pretended not to notice. Everyone carried private grief. He had no right to ask about hers. Nearly an hour later, the truck turned through tall iron gates that had already begun opening after cameras recognized the vehicle approaching with a temporary security authorization triggered by Victoria's identification. Ethan raised an eyebrow, surprised by the size of the property stretching across carefully trimmed lawns and towering oak trees. Warm lights glowed inside a beautiful stone mansion that looked more like a historic estate than a family home. Before he could step out, 2 members of the household staff hurried toward the truck with visible relief across their faces. One woman placed both hands over her mouth. "Miss Hayes," she whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan stepped back respectfully as they helped Victoria out of the passenger seat. One of the employees reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a thick envelope. "Sir, please accept this. Thank you for bringing her home." Ethan smiled politely and shook his head. "Make sure she gets some rest," he replied. "That is enough for me." Without waiting for another word, he climbed back into his old pickup and drove quietly into the night, never noticing the elderly woman standing behind an upstairs window, watching his truck disappear with an expression that slowly shifted from curiosity to stunned disbelief. Morning sunlight poured through the tall windows of Hayes Manor, but it brought Victoria Hayes no comfort. She opened her eyes slowly, the memories of the previous evening arriving only in scattered fragments. A crowded ballroom, endless speeches, another argument inside the boardroom, a glass she should never have accepted, then a quiet voice asking if she was all right. She sat upright immediately, looking around the elegant bedroom she had known since childhood. Her shoes rested neatly beside the bed. A folded blanket covered her instead of the expensive evening coat she vaguely remembered wearing. Nothing had been disturbed. Nothing had been taken. The housekeeper entered carrying a tray with tea and fresh fruit. Relief filled her face the moment she saw Victoria awake. "Good morning, Miss Hayes. We were so worried." Victoria rubbed her forehead gently. "Who brought me home?" The housekeeper smiled. "A gentleman in an old pickup truck. He refused every dollar we offered. He only asked us to make certain you rested." Victoria lowered her eyes. In her world, every favor came with paperwork, publicity, or expectations. Someone refusing money simply because it was the right thing to do almost sounded impossible. Downstairs, Eleanor Hayes sat quietly in the breakfast room, stirring untouched coffee as if lost inside memories no one else could see. Her daughter entered wearing simple clothes instead of the tailored business suits that usually announced another demanding day. Eleanor studied Victoria carefully. "You look tired." Victoria forced a small smile. "I am." Silence settled between them. It was a familiar silence, polished by years of conversations that never reached the places that mattered most. Finally, Victoria spoke. "Someone brought me home last night." Eleanor nodded gently. "I know. He would not even accept a reward." Eleanor looked toward the large window overlooking the gardens. "There are still people who measure wealth differently." Victoria sat down across from her mother. "I want to thank him properly." Eleanor hesitated before answering. "Then find him, because gratitude delayed too long sometimes becomes regret." The words surprised even Eleanor herself. Across town, Ethan was already back beneath the fluorescent lights of Harper Street Auto Repair. The scent of motor oil mixed with fresh coffee as he tightened bolts beneath the hood of an aging family sedan. Country music played softly through an old radio balanced on a dusty shelf, while sunlight filtered through the open garage doors. His coworker, Mike Dawson, laughed as he walked over carrying 2 paper cups. "Long night." Ethan smiled faintly. "A little longer than planned." "Another roadside rescue?" Mike asked. Ethan shrugged. "Just help someone get home safely." Mike grinned. "You really never change." Ethan accepted the coffee with quiet gratitude. "My daughter keeps reminding me what kind of man she believes I am. I would rather stay worthy of that." Hundreds of miles of busy highways separated strangers every day, yet destiny often crossed only a few quiet streets. Neither Ethan tightening another wrench nor Victoria standing beside the window of her family's estate could imagine that before another sunset, the search for one simple act of kindness would begin uncovering echoes of a family history that neither of them knew had never truly ended. The afternoon sun settled warmly over Chicago as Victoria sat alone inside the back seat of her company sedan, staring out the window instead of reviewing the thick stack of reports resting on her lap. Her assistant had spent the entire morning trying to persuade her to return to meetings, answer investors, and prepare for another television interview. But none of those responsibilities seemed nearly as important as finding the man who had quietly disappeared after expecting nothing in return. "We checked the hotel security cameras," her assistant finally said, scrolling through a tablet. His truck license plate was visible for only a few seconds, but we were able to identify the owner. Victoria looked up immediately. "Did he break any laws?" "No, Miss Hayes." "Then why are you hesitating?" The assistant smiled awkwardly. "Because he is exactly the opposite of what everyone expected." A single photograph appeared on the screen. Ethan stood outside a modest neighborhood repair shop wearing worn denim jeans, work boots, and a faded blue shirt with grease on both sleeves. Behind him sat an old pickup truck that had clearly seen better days. Victoria studied the picture much longer than necessary. There was nothing remarkable about his appearance, yet something inside his calm expression reminded her of the peace she had briefly felt while drifting in and out of sleep the night before. It was the face of someone who had stopped trying to impress the world years ago. "Cancel my afternoon appointments," she said quietly. The assistant blinked. "All of them. Everyone." Less than 40 minutes later, a sleek black sedan rolled slowly onto Harper Street and stopped across from the repair shop. Engines hummed beneath raised hoods while the scent of fresh rubber and motor oil drifted through the warm summer air. Ethan stood beside a family minivan explaining a repair estimate to an elderly couple with the same patience he seemed to offer everyone. He never noticed the expensive car waiting across the street. Victoria remained inside for several moments, watching silently. She expected confidence, perhaps even pride after rescuing a stranger from embarrassment. Instead, she saw simple kindness repeated again and again in ordinary moments. Ethan carried a heavy toolbox for an older mechanic whose back had begun bothering him. He knelt beside a little boy waiting with his grandfather and tightened the strap on the child's bicycle helmet after noticing it had come loose. When a customer apologized for delaying payment until next week, Ethan simply nodded and said, "Take care of your family first. We will work the rest out later." Victoria felt something unfamiliar settle inside her heart. She had spent years surrounded by brilliant people, ambitious people, successful people, but quiet goodness like this had become strangely rare. Finally, she stepped from the sedan. Ethan turned after hearing the car door close. For a brief second, surprise crossed his face before he recognized the woman from the previous night. "You are feeling better," he said with a gentle smile. Victoria nodded. "Because of you." Ethan shook his head softly. "No, because you made it home safely." She reached into her handbag before stopping herself. Money suddenly felt like the smallest possible response. Instead, she extended her hand. "I never properly introduced myself. My name is Victoria." Ethan wiped one hand carefully on a clean shop towel before shaking hers with quiet respect. "Ethan Walker." Neither of them noticed the black luxury sedan that had quietly turned onto the street behind them, nor the elderly woman inside who stared through the window with widening eyes, her breath catching as though she had just seen a ghost from another lifetime. For several quiet seconds, neither of them spoke. The sounds of impact wrenches, air compressors, and passing traffic blended into the warm afternoon like the steady rhythm of ordinary life. Victoria realized she had rehearsed a dozen elegant speeches during the drive across the city, yet standing in front of Ethan made every carefully chosen sentence disappear. "I came to thank you," she finally said. "Most people would have driven away." Ethan gave a small shrug. "Most people probably believed someone else would help." She lowered her eyes. "And you did not." "No," he answered simply. "Because I hoped someone would do the same for my daughter if she ever needed help." The sincerity in his voice carried no trace of self-congratulation. It sounded like the most natural truth in the world. Victoria smiled gently. Then I owe your daughter my gratitude too. Before Ethan could respond, the front door of the repair shop opened, and a little girl hurried outside carrying a lunchbox covered with hand-drawn flowers. Her light brown hair bounced against her shoulders as she ran across the parking lot with the excitement only children seemed able to protect from the worries of adulthood. "Daddy," Lily called with a bright smile before wrapping both arms around Ethan's waist. He laughed softly and knelt to her height. "Hey, sweetheart. How was art camp?" "I painted a lighthouse," she said proudly. "Mrs. Jenkins said lighthouses help people find their way home." Ethan looked at the colorful paper sticking out of her folder. She is right. Lily noticed Victoria standing nearby and offered an innocent smile. "Hello." Victoria smiled back almost automatically. "Hello. I am Victoria." "I am Lily," the little girl replied. "Thank you for bringing my daddy back. Sometimes he works too much." Ethan chuckled quietly while shaking his head. "I think you have that backwards." Lily giggled, completely unconcerned with embarrassment. Watching the exchange stirred something deep inside Victoria, something she had not allowed herself to feel for years. Board meetings rewarded confidence. Financial markets rewarded strategy. Yet this simple conversation between a father and his daughter revealed a kind of success no quarterly report could ever measure. She reached into her purse one last time and removed a cream-colored business card embossed with nothing more than her name and direct telephone number. "If you ever need anything," she said, extending it toward Ethan. "Anything at all, please call me." Ethan accepted the card respectfully without studying it. "Thank you. You are not even going to ask what I do?" she asked with quiet amusement. He smiled. "You told me your name. That seemed more important." The answer caught her completely off guard. Across the street, Eleanor Hayes remained seated inside the waiting sedan, her trembling fingers pressed gently against the window. She could see Ethan laughing with Lily. She could see the kindness in his posture, the familiar tilt of his head when he listened, and the small silver wedding band still hanging from a chain beneath his shirt instead of resting on his hand. A memory she had buried years ago suddenly returned with startling clarity. Her daughter Amelia had once shown her a photograph of the young man she loved, smiling beside an old pickup truck with hope shining in his eyes. Eleanor whispered almost without breathing, "It cannot be." But as Ethan lifted Lily into his arms and turned slightly toward the sunlight, the impossible began to feel frighteningly real. Eleanor Hayes remained motionless long after Victoria's sedan pulled away from the repair shop. The driver quietly asked whether she wished to return home, but she did not answer immediately. Her eyes stayed fixed on the garage until Ethan disappeared behind one of the service bays, laughing softly as Lily proudly showed him the lighthouse painting she had carried from art camp. Eleanor felt her heartbeat quicken with every passing second. There had been countless years since she had allowed herself to think about Amelia without carrying the heavy weight of regret. Yet the man she had just seen stirred memories she believed time had already buried. Finally she whispered, "Take me home." The drive back to the estate passed in complete silence. Sunlight filtered through rows of maple trees while Lake Michigan shimmered peacefully in the distance. But Eleanor barely noticed the familiar scenery. Her thoughts drifted backward nearly 3 decades to the afternoon Amelia had stood inside the same mansion with tears in her eyes, asking only for acceptance. Eleanor had believed she was protecting her daughter from a difficult future. Instead, she had driven a painful distance between them that neither of them ever found the chance to fully repair. The official reports years later had spoken only of a tragic accident, a private funeral, and unfinished conversations that would remain unfinished forever. As soon as she entered her study, Eleanor unlocked a cedar cabinet that had not been opened in years. Inside rested carefully labeled photo albums, handwritten letters, and a small wooden keepsake box tied with a faded blue ribbon. Dust floated gently through the afternoon light as she lifted one album onto the desk. Her hands trembled while turning each page. Birthdays, family vacations, school recitals. Then she reached a photograph that stole the breath from her lungs. Amelia stood beside a young man wearing worn blue jeans and a simple plaid shirt. His arm rested comfortably around her shoulders. Behind them sat an aging pickup truck with chipped paint and a warm autumn sky stretching across the background. The young man's smile was unmistakable. Time had added a few lines around his eyes and touched his hair with faint traces of gray, but there was no doubt. It was Ethan. Eleanor slowly lowered herself into the chair, pressing trembling fingers against the edge of the photograph. "Dear Lord," she whispered. "He is alive." A soft knock interrupted the silence. Victoria stepped into the room, carrying 2 cups of tea. She immediately noticed the old photographs scattered across the desk. "I have not seen these in years," she said gently. Eleanor closed the album before Victoria could look too closely. "Sometimes memories return when we least expect them." Victoria smiled faintly. "I cannot stop thinking about that man either." Eleanor looked up carefully. "Why?" Victoria stared toward the window overlooking the gardens. "Because he treated me like my life mattered before he knew my name. I cannot explain it, but being around him felt strangely familiar." Eleanor's heart sank. Familiar. The same word had echoed inside her own thoughts since the moment she first saw Ethan. She waited until Victoria quietly left the room before reaching for the family telephone. There was only one person she trusted to uncover the truth without attracting attention. When the private investigator answered, Eleanor spoke calmly despite the storm building inside her heart. "I need everything you can find on a man named Ethan Walker," she said softly. "And I need to know whether fate has just returned someone my family lost years ago." 3 days passed with quiet patience. Yet for Eleanor Hayes, every hour felt heavier than the last. She continued attending charity luncheons, signing foundation papers, and smiling politely through conversations that barely reached her ears. Beneath the calm routine, one question refused to leave her heart. Could Ethan Walker truly be the young man Amelia had once loved so deeply? Late Thursday afternoon, the telephone inside her private study rang exactly as promised. "Mrs. Hayes," the investigator said, "I have completed the preliminary report." Eleanor closed the study door before answering. "Tell me everything." The man's voice remained calm and professional. "Ethan Walker is 40 years old. He owns no large business, no significant investments, and no criminal record. He has worked as an automotive technician for nearly 15 years. 5 years ago, his wife, Amelia Walker, passed away following a traffic accident. Since then, he has raised their daughter alone." Eleanor slowly lowered herself into the chair. Every word felt like another missing piece quietly returning to its place. "His wife's maiden name?" she whispered. There was a brief pause as papers turned on the other end of the line. That was unusually difficult to trace because several records were sealed after the estate settlement. "However, I located an older marriage application. Her maiden name was Hayes." Eleanor closed her eyes. Tears gathered before she realized she was crying. "Continue." "There is something else," the investigator added. "Most public records list very little about her family. It appears she intentionally avoided using her birth name after leaving home in her early 20s. The room became completely silent except for the ticking of an antique grandfather clock standing against the far wall. Eleanor remembered that painful day with unbearable clarity. Pride had spoken louder than love. Harsh words had replaced gentle ones. Amelia had walked away carrying only a small suitcase, promising that one day everyone would understand. That day had never come. Across the city, Ethan knew nothing of the quiet investigation unfolding around his family. After finishing work, he stopped at a neighborhood grocery store with Lily, carefully comparing prices while she searched excitedly for her favorite cereal. "Can we get the blueberry pancakes this weekend?" Lily asked hopefully. Ethan smiled. "If they are still on sale tomorrow, absolutely." She grinned as though he had promised a trip around the world. They walked home carrying simple paper bags while the evening breeze rustled through the maple trees lining their street. Lily slipped her small hand into his. "Daddy." "Yes, sweetheart." "Do you think Mommy can still see us?" Ethan looked toward the golden sunset stretching across the quiet neighborhood. "I do," he answered softly. "And I think she smiles every time she sees you being kind." Lily nodded thoughtfully before hugging his arm. "Then I want to make her smile every day." At Hayes Manor, Eleanor gently removed the old photograph of Amelia and Ethan from the family album and placed it beside the investigator's report. The younger faces had changed with time, but not enough to erase the truth. She looked from the photograph to the page listing Ethan's daughter's name. Lily Walker, 8 years old. Eleanor whispered the name several times until it no longer felt like words on paper, but like family waiting just beyond reach. Then her eyes widened as another realization quietly settled into place. If Ethan truly was Amelia's husband, then little Lily was not a stranger at all. She was Eleanor's granddaughter, and Victoria had no idea that the gentle little girl she had met outside the repair shop was her own niece. The following Saturday arrived wrapped in bright sunshine and a gentle breeze that carried the scent of fresh flowers through the streets of Evanston. Ethan had promised Lily a visit to the neighborhood community fair after finishing a small repair for one of his longtime customers. The event was simple, filled with homemade pies, local musicians, children's games, and families enjoying the final weeks of summer before school began again. It was the kind of place Amelia had always loved because, as she used to say, ordinary places often held extraordinary moments. At nearly the same hour, Victoria had convinced Eleanor to leave the estate for a charity fundraiser being held only a few blocks away. "You have spent too much time inside lately," Victoria said gently. Eleanor smiled faintly. "Perhaps today is exactly where I am supposed to be." Neither woman realized how true those words would become. The fairgrounds buzzed with quiet laughter as children raced between colorful booths carrying balloons almost as tall as they were. Ethan finished repairing a volunteer's small generator before wiping his hands on a clean towel. Lily skipped happily beside him holding a paper bag. Filled with homemade cookies, she insisted on sharing with anyone who looked lonely. "Daddy," she whispered excitedly, "can we give some to those ladies?" Ethan followed her gaze toward two elegantly dressed women walking slowly along the flower displays. One was Victoria. The other was Eleanor. "Of course," he answered with a smile. "Kindness is always worth sharing." Lily hurried forward before Ethan could catch up. "Hello," she said brightly, offering the bag with both hands. "My daddy says cookies taste better when you do not eat them alone." Victoria laughed softly and accepted one. "Your daddy sounds very wise." Lily beamed with pride. "He learned it from my mommy." The simple sentence struck Eleanor like a distant church bell echoing across years of silence. She knelt carefully to Lily's height, her voice almost trembling. "Your mommy must have been a wonderful woman." Lily nodded. "She was. Daddy says she always looked for people who needed hope." Eleanor swallowed hard. "What was her name, sweetheart?" Without hesitation, Lily reached into the small backpack hanging over her shoulder. "I carry her picture everywhere." She carefully removed a worn photograph protected inside a clear plastic sleeve. Ethan had placed it there years earlier after Lily asked for something she could hold whenever she missed her mother. Lily proudly handed it to Eleanor. The moment Eleanor looked down, the world around her disappeared. The photograph showed Amelia standing beneath a large oak tree, smiling with the same gentle warmth Eleanor remembered from long ago. Her wedding band caught the sunlight while one arm rested around Ethan's shoulders and the other cradled a baby wrapped in a pale blue blanket. Tears blurred Eleanor's vision almost instantly. Her fingers trembled so noticeably that Victoria reached out in concern. "Mother, what is wrong?" Eleanor could barely breathe. She traced Amelia's face with one shaking fingertip as though afraid the image might vanish if she blinked. This is Amelia," she whispered. Victoria looked down at the photograph, confused. "You know her?" Eleanor slowly lifted her tear-filled eyes toward Lily. "Know her," she said softly. "She was my daughter." At that exact moment, Ethan turned the corner carrying 2 cups of fresh lemonade, smiling before he noticed the photograph resting in Eleanor's trembling hands. And for the first time since Amelia's passing, the quiet past he had protected so carefully began stepping into the light. The laughter from nearby children faded into a distant blur as time itself seemed to pause beneath the old maple trees. Ethan stopped only a few steps away, the 2 cups of lemonade growing warm in his hands while his eyes settled on the photograph Eleanor held so carefully. He recognized it immediately. It had been taken during one of the happiest afternoons Amelia had ever known, only weeks after Lily was born. For several long seconds no one spoke. Victoria looked from her mother's tear-filled eyes to Ethan's stunned expression, unable to understand why 2 strangers suddenly carried the weight of decades inside a single moment. Lily quietly slipped beside Ethan and wrapped both hands around his arm. "Daddy," she whispered. Ethan gently placed the lemonade on a nearby picnic table before kneeling beside his daughter. His voice remained calm even though his heart pounded harder than it had in years. "It is all right, sweetheart." Eleanor slowly stood, still holding the photograph with trembling hands. "Ethan," she said softly, almost afraid the name would disappear if spoken too loudly. "You remember me." Ethan lowered his eyes for a brief moment before meeting hers again. Yes, he answered quietly. Mrs. Hayes. Victoria stared in disbelief. You know each other? Neither of them answered immediately. A cool breeze stirred the leaves overhead, as if even nature refused to interrupt what was about to unfold. Finally, Eleanor drew a slow breath. Amelia was my daughter. Victoria frowned, confused. Mother, you told me my sister died years ago after leaving home. You never told me she had married. Eleanor's shoulders sagged beneath the weight of old regret. Because by the time I learned where she was, it was already too late. Ethan remained silent. He had replayed that painful chapter of life countless times, yet hearing it spoken aloud still reopened wounds that had never fully healed. Victoria looked toward him. Amelia, was your wife? Ethan nodded once. She was the best person I have ever known. Lily looked up at her father with innocent curiosity. Daddy, are these the family Mommy used to pray for? Ethan smiled sadly. Amelia had never spoken bitterly about her past. Even after difficult years, she had ended every evening prayer with the same quiet hope that one day hearts would heal. He gently brushed a strand of hair away from Lily's face. Yes, sweetheart. I believe they are. Eleanor covered her mouth as tears escaped freely. She prayed for us. Ethan answered with the same quiet dignity Amelia had always admired in him. Every single night. The words broke something inside Eleanor that years of pride had kept sealed shut. I thought she hated me, she whispered. Ethan slowly shook his head. She missed you. There is a difference. Victoria felt tears filling her own eyes. She had spent her entire life believing she had lost a sister to silence without ever understanding why. Now she discovered that her sister had built a loving family only a few miles away before tragedy ended the chance for reconciliation. She looked toward Lily, who still held Ethan's hand with complete trust. The little girl smiled warmly, completely unaware of the extraordinary truth unfolding around her. Victoria whispered almost to herself, then Lily. Eleanor nodded gently, her voice trembling with both sorrow and hope. Lily is your niece. The words settled over the quiet fairgrounds with the stillness of sunrise after a long night. And in that silent moment, 4 lives forever changed without a single raised voice. No one moved for several moments. The cheerful sounds of the community fair continued around them. But for the 4 people standing beneath the maple trees, the world had become astonishingly quiet. Victoria looked at Lily again, noticing details she had overlooked before. The same gentle smile Amelia used to wear in old family photographs. The same curious eyes. The same habit of holding someone's hand with complete trust. She felt an unexpected ache rise inside her chest. 8 years. 8 birthdays. 8 Christmas mornings. 8 summers she never knew her niece existed. Slowly she knelt until her eyes met Lily's. Hello, Lily, she said softly. May I ask you something? Lily nodded politely. Do you like asking questions? Victoria smiled through tears. Very much. Lily giggled. Daddy says questions help people understand each other. Victoria glanced toward Ethan before looking back at the little girl. Your daddy is right. She hesitated for a moment, searching for words simple enough for a child but honest enough for the moment. Your mommy and I, we were sisters. Lily blinked in surprise. Really? Victoria nodded. Yes. Lily looked toward Ethan for reassurance. He gently smiled. It appears we have just learned something very important. Lily turned back to Victoria with the innocent honesty only children possess. Does that mean you are my aunt? Victoria's composure finally gave way. Tears rolled gently down her cheeks as she whispered, Yes. If you will let me be. Without hesitation, Lily stepped forward and wrapped her small arms around Victoria's shoulders. Mommy always said families should hug when they find each other. Victoria closed her eyes, embracing the little girl as years of unanswered questions quietly dissolved into one simple moment of grace. Nearby, Eleanor wiped away fresh tears while Ethan watched silently. Amelia had dreamed of reconciliation more times than he could count, but neither of them had imagined it would happen like this. After a long moment, Victoria stood again, still holding Lily's hand. She turned toward Ethan, her expression filled not only with gratitude, but also with quiet regret. Why did no one ever tell us? Ethan answered honestly. After Amelia passed away, I searched for an address that no longer existed. The old phone numbers had been disconnected. She had always hoped to return herself one day. I never wanted to reopen old wounds if your family had chosen to leave the past behind. Eleanor lowered her head. We never stopped loving her. We only allowed pride to speak louder than love. Ethan did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the bright blue sky stretching above the fairgrounds. Amelia used to say forgiveness is not pretending the pain never happened. It is choosing not to let pain write the ending. Eleanor quietly covered her face as another wave of emotion swept over her. Victoria reached for her mother's hand, realizing for the first time how deeply both generations had suffered from the same silence. Lily gently tugged Ethan's sleeve. Daddy. Yes, sweetheart. Do you think Mommy knows we found them? Ethan looked down at his daughter before smiling with peaceful certainty. I think she has known before any of us did. Above them, a gentle breeze stirred the branches, carrying a few golden leaves slowly across the grass. And in that quiet afternoon, the family Amelia had prayed would someday become whole took its very first step toward finding one another again. The following morning arrived beneath a pale autumn sky as Ethan parked his pickup beside the quiet cemetery where Amelia had been laid to rest 5 years earlier. He had come every Sunday without fail, carrying fresh flowers chosen by Lily and spending a few peaceful moments speaking softly to the woman whose love still shaped every decision he made. This morning felt different. A second black sedan slowly entered through the iron gates and stopped several yards away. Eleanor stepped out first, followed by Victoria, both carrying simple white lilies instead of the elaborate arrangements wealth could easily provide. Neither woman spoke as they walked toward the small granite headstone. Lily held Ethan's hand tightly, but smiled when she saw the flowers. Mommy liked lilies, she whispered. Ethan nodded. They were always her favorite. Eleanor's legs suddenly felt weak as she stood before her daughter's name carved into polished stone. She reached out with trembling fingers, gently brushing away a single fallen leaf. I should have come years ago, she whispered. I told myself I needed more time, but the truth was I was ashamed. No one interrupted her. Even the gentle breeze seemed to grow quieter. Tears rolled freely down Eleanor's face as decades of carefully hidden regret finally found its voice. Amelia, I was wrong. I believed I was protecting you when all I was protecting was my own pride. I judged the man you loved before I ever took the time to know his heart. I lost precious years that can never be returned, and I will carry that sorrow for the rest of my life. If somehow you can hear me today, I am asking for the forgiveness I should have sought long ago. Victoria quietly placed her flowers beside the headstone before speaking through tears of her own. I spent years wondering why my sister disappeared from my life. I never stopped loving you, even when I did not understand what had happened. I wish I could have known your husband. I wish I could have watched Lily grow up. I cannot change yesterday, but I promise I will never let your daughter wonder whether she is loved again. Ethan remained silent until both women stepped back. He looked at Amelia's name with the familiar tenderness that had never faded. You always believed broken families could heal, he said softly. I wanted to believe you, but I was not always strong enough. Somehow you kept your promise anyway. Lily slowly knelt beside the flowers and carefully laid a small drawing against the base of the stone. It showed 4 grown-ups holding hands with one little girl beneath a bright blue sky. Above them, she had written in careful block letters, "Family finds its way home." I made it for Mommy, she explained. So she knows everyone found each other. Eleanor covered her mouth as quiet tears returned once more. Ethan gently placed one comforting hand on her shoulder. There was no anger in his expression, no accusation, only the quiet dignity Amelia had loved from the very beginning. In that simple act, Eleanor understood something she had searched for all her life. Forgiveness did not erase the years they had lost, but it opened the door to every year they still had left together. The weeks that followed did not unfold with grand announcements or dramatic celebrations. Instead, they were built the same way trust had always been built, one quiet moment at a time. Victoria never arrived at Ethan's home with expensive gifts or promises that money could solve everything. She arrived carrying homemade blueberry muffins after calling ahead to ask whether Lily liked them. She learned that Ethan preferred repairing things himself before accepting help. She discovered that Lily loved reading on the front porch while the evening sun painted the neighborhood in shades of gold. Most importantly, she learned that becoming family again required patience rather than perfection. One Saturday morning, Victoria appeared at the repair shop wearing simple jeans and a light sweater instead of the tailored business suits that had once defined every hour of her life. Mike Dawson nearly dropped the wrench in his hand when he recognized one of the most respected chief executive officers in the country walking through the garage carrying a cardboard tray filled with coffee and fresh pastries. Ethan looked up from beneath the hood of an old pickup truck and smiled with quiet surprise. "You did not have to bring breakfast." Victoria laughed softly. "My aunt used to tell me that showing up hungry was poor manners." Ethan raised an eyebrow with a warm smile. "Your aunt?" Victoria nodded. "I suppose I should start practicing being part of a family again." Nearby, Lily ran toward her carrying a small notebook. "Aunt Victoria, I finished my lighthouse story." Victoria accepted the notebook with genuine excitement. "Can I read it?" Lily nodded proudly. "But only if you promise to tell me what happens next." They sat together on an old wooden bench outside the garage while Lily read every page aloud. Ethan watched quietly from inside the service bay, noticing how naturally the two of them laughed together. Amelia would have loved this, he thought. Across town, Eleanor had quietly begun another kind of healing. She reopened old boxes of family photographs, carefully labeling every picture that included Amelia before placing copies into a new album for Lily. Alongside each photograph, she wrote handwritten memories that no history book could preserve, favorite songs, childhood adventures, recipes they baked together, and the story of how Amelia once insisted on rescuing an injured robin until it could fly again. "Your mother always believed every living thing deserved another chance," Eleanor told Lily one afternoon as they turned another page together. Lily smiled gently. "Daddy says that is why she chose him." Eleanor looked across the room at Ethan, who was repairing one of Lily's old books with clear tape instead of throwing it away. "Your daddy is a very wise man," she said quietly. As autumn slowly gave way to early winter, the empty places around the family table became fewer with every passing week. Conversations lasted longer. Laughter arrived more easily. Old regrets slowly surrendered to new memories. No one tried to replace Amelia because no one ever could. Instead, they honored her by living the lessons she had quietly left behind. Kindness became their tradition. Forgiveness became their inheritance. And without anyone planning it, a family once separated by silence began discovering that love, when protected with patience and grace, could still find its way home years after everyone believed the journey had already ended. The first snow of December settled gently across the neighborhood, covering rooftops, sidewalks, and quiet streets with a blanket of white that softened every hard edge the year had carried. Inside Ethan's modest home, warm light spilled through the windows while the scent of cinnamon, fresh bread, and pine filled every corner. The house was not large, but it had become rich in something far more valuable than space. It was full of voices that had once believed they would never find one another again. Lily hurried from the living room, carrying a handmade ornament she had painted herself. On one side, she had written the word hope. On the other, she had carefully written family. "Grandma," she called with a bright smile, "can you help me hang this one?" Eleanor accepted the ornament with trembling hands, her eyes filling once again with grateful tears. Months earlier, she would have given away every possession she owned for the chance to hear that single word spoken by the little girl standing before her. Together, they placed the ornament near the center of the tree, where the lights reflected gently across its hand-painted surface. Victoria stood nearby, wrapping another strand of lights around the branches, while Ethan carried a tray of steaming mugs into the room. "Hot chocolate for everyone," he announced with his familiar quiet smile. Lily accepted her mug before looking toward the framed photograph resting above the fireplace. Amelia smiled back from the picture exactly as she always had, her eyes filled with warmth, kindness, and quiet confidence. Lily walked over and whispered softly, "We did it, Mommy." Everybody came home. No one interrupted her. Some moments deserved silence more than words. Later that evening, the family stepped onto the front porch together as gentle snowflakes drifted through the glow of the porch light. Ethan stood beside Lily. Eleanor stood beside Victoria. There were no reporters, no cameras, no headlines announcing the extraordinary story that had quietly unfolded. The world continued exactly as it always had, unaware that one simple decision made on a rainy night had rewritten the future of an entire family. Victoria looked toward Ethan with sincere gratitude. If you had driven past me that night, none of this would have happened. Ethan shook his head gently. Kindness rarely lets us see where the road ends. It only asks us to take the next step. Eleanor smiled through peaceful tears. And sometimes that single step leads us back to the people we thought we had lost forever. Lily reached for Ethan's hand with one hand and Victoria's with the other before smiling up at Eleanor. Family pictures are better when nobody is missing. They gathered together beneath the softly falling snow as a neighbor quietly offered to take their photograph. No one posed perfectly. No one tried to look important. They simply stood close to one another, grateful for the ordinary miracle of being together. When the camera clicked, Ethan glanced briefly toward Amelia's photograph visible through the living room window. For just an instant he imagined she was smiling exactly as she always had whenever love chose forgiveness over pride. Life had not erased sorrow. It had not returned the years they had lost. But it had proven something Amelia believed until her very last day. Quiet dignity will always outlive anger. Grace will always travel farther than regret. And sometimes the greatest miracle is not finding wealth, success, or recognition. Sometimes the greatest miracle is discovering that one small act of kindness can guide a broken family all the way back home.